Good morning to all. I welcome Mr. Ravi Krishnamurthy, President, SBI Life Insurance Company Limited. You all know SBI Life Insurance Company is one of the front runners in the life insurance services in our country. I really thank you, sir, for accepting our invite in the midst of your busy schedule. Despite being in travel, Mr. Ravi has been kind enough to be with us to share his thoughts and experiences. We're really fortunate to hear on BFSI sectoral practices from someone like Mr. Ravi, who's a leader with immense experience in the BFSI sector. Unlike in other sectors, like as you all know, maybe in manufacturing, logistics, etc. Unlike all these sectors, BFSI requires a robust control regime, since even a small error by one of the lower level resource involved in the financial transaction execution may result in a very high impact. So, I mean, we all know how Citibank, acting as a loan agent to the cosmetic company Revlon, accidentally transferred close to USD 900 million, which is about 7,000 crores in Indian rupees, to the company's lenders, and they are struggling to get it back. With that kind of an impact, it becomes important for financial institutions to be extra cautious and have all sorts of required controls to ensure that they do not end up losing money, because they are guardian or custodian of the public money, and they are serving the public with whatever they have received from the public. So in today's session, we'll be hearing from Mr. Ravi on three important things. One is he will talk about the different types of audits that are being carried out in BFSI sector, and the purpose and objectives behind these audits. So you know that generally in financial institutions, banking and financial institutions, they carry out different kinds of audit. At any point in time, you get into a bank, one reviewer or one auditor will be sitting doing something, right? And that's a kind of tight control regime they have. They have different kinds of audit, like risk-based internal audit. They will have concurrent auditors sitting and doing the work on a day-to-day basis. And as we all have, they do have statutory audits and tax audits. Then as a transactional audit, they will also be doing credit audits, stock audits, etc. They have regulatory requirements. So either RBI or IRDA will be regularly doing inspections for them. And on the cybersecurity and information security point of view, they will be carrying out system audit, information security audit, or ISO audit. So there are quite a lot of audits. And on top of all these things, if something goes wrong, they will also have forensic audit. So that's a kind of control regime they have. And that's why you could see that at any point in time in any bank or financial institution, some auditor or the other would be sitting and doing evaluation. So, we will not get a better person than Mr. Ravi to tell us what kind of control regime which is there with BFSI sector. And the second thing is he will also be dealing with the major risks that emanate from BFSI sector and how they are being mitigated. The risks which are prevalent in a BFSI sector, though on a high level looks similar to the other sectors, BFSI has more nuances. It is more sensitive. So he will also be talking about the major risks. And last but not least, he will also be talking about the role of the auditors. What is expected out of the auditors in their efforts to deliver an effective review of the various complex processes and controls in a BFSI environment. That is one thing which you'll be talking about. I'm happy to note that good number of participants have joined to hear Mr. Ravi, and I personally look forward as an audience to hear to Mr. Ravi's thoughts and benefit out of it. I thank Mr. Ravi once again for being in our midst to share his thoughts. I now hand over the session to Ms. Jayashree for further proceedings. Thank you all.
Thank you, Manian sir. Good morning, each and everyone for able to make it to this session organized by IIM Madras chapter and IIM Madras Women's Forum. I have immense pleasure on behalf of the chapter and the Women's Forum in introducing our guest speaker of the day. Though Mr. Manian had given a brief about Mr. Ravi and about what he is about his professional experience, I still would want to give more details about his overall experience. He is a top management finance sector professional with over 30 years of experience in building strong, sustainable governance and profitable business organizations, and is also an award winner nationally as well as globally. We are glad to welcome and introduce to you all Mr. Ravi Krishnamurthy, who is a life member of BMA, a fellow member of the Institute of Directors, and president at SBI Life. He holds key strategic responsibility for functional guidance to all the areas in the company, besides overseeing the business and operating goals for the specific zones that he is handling. Prior to the current role, Mr. Krishnamurthy was the Chief Operating Officer at SBI Life, having worked for over a decade with SBI in corporate lending initially, and then another decade with ICICI Bank as part of the original startup team to build the ICICI Bank. He has varied experiences and expertise in corporate as well as retail banking. Mr. Krishnamurthy has also played a key role of a startup team leader of SBI Life and has led SBI Life to success in various aspects of leadership in the insurance industry. He has led initiatives for various awards for SBI Life, Ramakrishna Bajaj National Quality Award, and the World Class title in Asia Pacific Quality Organization Global Performance Excellence Award. Mr. Krishnamurthy is certified by the Indian Institute of Bankers, the Indian Institute of Insurance, and he holds a PGDBM from NMIMS Mumbai in the area of human resources. He is also certified by the Directors Club and possesses a certificate in business excellence from Columbia Business School. Other than this, his personal interests include participating in marathons, a yoga practitioner, his deep interest in classical and semi-classical music, and is also a volunteer with Isha Foundation. Today, as Mr. Manian was mentioning, we will be hearing from Mr. Krishnamurthy about his experiences and views in the sector, BFSI sector, along with the key risks that we should address from the BFSI sector. It would be a great privilege to listen to him. Welcome, Mr. Ravi. Thank you for making the session. Making up to the session and amidst your busy schedules. Welcome, sir.
Yeah. Good morning. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Manian and Mr. Jayashree, for this quite a lavish introduction about what I am. I only pray that today's session is useful to all the participants and you really benefit from me. Partly because you will benefit from me because I have never been an auditor in my life, but I have been the other side, so I know how we manage. So that is the what do we do inside the company? How do we lead? How do we manage our policies, board policies? So that gives a different insight to you rather than an auditor's insight, because we actually manage the show from inside. We manage policies, we build SOPs, we build practices, and we have our own systems of internal audits to kind of look at preventive risk management in a big way, so that we are able to present a good picture to the company, to the society, and to the customers. I have a small presentation, but the presentation is only as a backdrop to you. You can read the presentation. I may not be reading it, but I'll be explaining to you in context of the presentation certain experiences, certain key points to bear in mind when you are looking at the BFSI sector. All of you are very experienced auditors. Most of you are chartered accountants here, so you don't need any guidance on how to do a tax audit, how to do a manufacturing audit, how to do an ERP audit. Those things you are very familiar with. But BFSI sector is a little peculiar. The reason is that it deals fundamentally in money. Raw material is money, work in progress is money, finished goods is money, sundry debtor is money, sundry creditor is money. So it's all financial transaction. So when you deal with financial transaction, there is a lot of trust that public places with you. So therefore, the risks associated with this are related to trust, and that is why the way you audit and the spirit of the audit completely changes when you move from manufacturing to banking industry or insurance industry for that matter. Since I had a experience in both banking and insurance, it is my privilege to share with you both the banking and the insurance related compliance risk typically in the BFSI sector. Obviously, the views expressed by me today are personal. They don't associate to the company with which I'm associated. But it is my privilege to have been associated with some of the biggest entities in the banking and the insurance industry. And being associated from the startup has given me an idea of what goes wrong in the beginning stages. How does process mature, and how do people mature in an organization so that we are able to get on top of the risks in this sector. I would like my teammate to run this presentation. So the topic is, of course, compliance risk in BFSI sector. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So as you know, auditing is a very challenging job. This is a small cartoon which kind of shows how it works. While the auditor is busy trying to find out what is going wrong inside the company, people are working on it's like, you're preparing a game for dodgeballs. You're trying to find out how to manage the auditor. So what to give, what not to give, how to dodge the questions that are being placed. This is one part of typical external audit challenges that internal organizations play. And so that's why this small humorous cartoon for you, just to show that what happens, what is the talk inside the organization when you land up there. What are they talking? Who's the auditor? What is his experience? What will he ask? What do we give? What do we don't give? How do we dodge? What is the time period? When does the audit end? So how do we postpone this? Which one we show first? Which one we show last? These are some of the things which happens in all organizations. Every organization tries to manage stuff so that they feel that they can manage it better inside. But then you as an auditor have a challenge of this kind where you're not the most welcome guest there. But at the same time, how do you add value and how do you bring value to the table is something entirely which will actually make you a welcome guest in the company in the years to come, because every board, every top management really wants to know what is going wrong. At the top, they really want to know, and they want to listen to the internal auditors, to the external auditors more, because employees themselves will never come back with truth about what is happening inside for various reasons. And one of the biggest things in the BFSI sector is what is called as conflict of interest. So you will hear more about this as I go in the slides. Every transaction that you see, every policy that you read, you must look for what is the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest can be of various kinds. So let's look at this pyramid of audit. The lowest pyramid of audit, the simplest audit which happens at the concurrent audit stage or at the basic transaction stages, what is the standard operating procedure of the company and what is the actual practice? So how is a deposit accepted? How is a bank account opened? How is a locker account opened? How do you give access to a locker? How do you sanction a loan? And how do you put through a clearing transaction? How do you put through a fixed deposit receipt? And how do you give a maturity proceed to the customer? What are the standard operating processes for each of the activities? And good organizations always have standard operating processes for them. And you try to see what actually is a practice. And how do you check the practice? You look at samples. And then you look at samples to check whether the samples exhibit what is written in the standard operating process. This is a typical, very generic banking or BFSI sector audit where you try to check the input and the output. The second level is, what is the more mature level is the standard operating process itself in alignment with the board policy. So the board has a risk policy, the board has an audit policy, the board has a process policy, board has an IT policy. So whether the standard operating process reflects the board policy and how often is it changed? Does it change with situations? Does it change with environment? So this is a second level audit. The highest level audit is obviously the board policy versus the regulation. Is the board policy really reflecting the regulation of the land? The time to time regulations to which the company is subject to. A bank is subject to RBI regulations. It is subject to SEBI regulations. So whether an insurance company is subject to insurance IRDA regulations. So different regulations operate, and they try to see whether the board policy is actually reflective of the regulation and whether changes are carried out from time to time. So this is a simple pyramid of audit, what I would call as the maturity level of audit. The lowest level you see is SOP versus practice, and the highest level you see is actually typically a board policy versus regulation audit, which is just to see whether the regulation is actually getting reflected in the board policies. Next. So I mentioned about standard operating procedures. So look at this. So this is a Dilbert cartoon, just to say. So I want you to develop a procedure for operating policies. This is how a typical company will look at. So do we have a policy on how to develop procedure? I think someone wrote a white paper on that. What's the procedure for finding white papers? Maybe you could ask around. And then later that night, so what do? I ask around to see if anyone knows about a white paper that talks about a policy for creating procedures to create policies. Why this humorous cartoon is, many a times you will find a lot of English in policies. But what you need to do as auditors is to see the material content of the policy. What is written there, which matters to you, has to be deciphered from a whole lot of text and paper and English written from there. So the intelligence lies in typically in BFS sector is to decipher what exactly is the material content and the essence of the audit. So typically when you go to a branch or to a bank to do an audit or an insurance company to do audit, the first thing you ask for is what are the board policies. And then you try to see what you have already studied the regulation beforehand, because it is always good habit to understand the regulations governing banks and insurance company before you go for an audit of a bank. Then you try to see whether the board policies reflect that, and then what are the various committees that govern the board policies, and how are standard operating processes fixed, and how are they arranged, and how do they reflect from time to time the changing regulations. So one of the test checks to see is when a regulation changes, how is the process carried out in the organization? What happens after a new regulation comes, or a new rule comes, or a new circular comes from RBI or IRDA? What do you do next? What does the company do next? How do they go about changing the standard operating procedure? Is it very ad hoc, or is it a systematic process? Is it a committee governed standard operating process change? These things matter a lot, because what happens is you see at the bottom transaction issues, but what is the systemic flaw is what auditors finally have to find out. You report transactions, you are at the base level of the audit, but you report systemic issues, you become more and more useful to the organization. The organization starts looking at you as a very useful element, and they start looking at what can I get out of this auditor. And generally good auditors are preferred by companies because they give you insights which an employee cannot give. Internally, an employee, maybe by conflict of interest, or maybe because he's so blind to it, because he believes that he's the best and he doesn't want to share what is going wrong, or he just can't see what is going wrong. So that is why this slightly humorous cartoon as to how within the organizations people go about preparing policies, and sometimes the policies may not really reflect what you want. But then if you go through the material content of the audit committee minutes, the various board committee minutes, the previous audit reports, the previous concurrent audit reports, they will kind of give you a very good idea about what are the methodologies that go into standard operating processes. Because ultimately, at the end of the day-to-day transactions of customers with the bank and the insurance companies carried out through standard operating procedure. So our job is to see how robust is the standard operating procedure process, which when you compare with the practice, it gives you results on what are the deficiencies in the bank or the insurance company. Next. Just to give you an idea, there may be people who are already doing banking audit. There may be people who are beginners. So I am trying to be a little bit basic here. See, what happens is banking, if you look at the primary function is accepting deposits, granting loans. And then nowadays, a lot of secondary functions have come: transfer of funds, collection of checks, portfolio management, and then the most important parts which are coming. One of the things which I would like to mention here is lockers. Locker is a very good example of a secondary function in a bank, because in a locker, you go and keep things. The bank doesn't know what you kept inside. The bank is not accountable for it strictly, because they're not counting what you're keeping inside. They're not privy to what you're doing. But at the end of the day, if something is missing from the locker, then the process of administration of locker services comes under scrutiny. This is the most peculiar part of the banking transaction. The rest is quite straightforward. Accepting and deposits and granting advances. I'll dwell a little bit more when we come to the next part. But here I would like to say that locker is a very specific function, or let's say upselling of third-party products, bank selling insurance products, or bank selling mutual fund products. The bank is not the manufacturer of the product, but at the same time, the bank is responsible for the correct communication of the product to the end customer. But the bank may not be responsible for the benefit coming out of it. But the bank is responsible for ensuring that the communication is proper. So there an element of trust comes in, though they are not manufacturers. Locker is a different example where you keep something inside. The bank doesn't know what you kept. They are not supposed to know, in fact. But at the same time, if something is missing or complaints come of that kind, it puts serious scrutiny of the locker access system. Who has the keys to the system? What is the process of duplicate keys? How do the functionaries in the bank operate? All these questions come in when the underlying process, to see whether the underlying process of privacy of locker access, if that is threatened in any way, or is there any breach to that security of a privacy of a customer's access to his own locker. Move next. So before I go here, let me give you some idea. If you look at deposits, the fundamental part is accepting deposits is a trust, because you are lending that deposit, and out of that revenue, you are repaying the deposit or you're repaying the interest. One of the two things. So servicing of the deposit or repaying of the deposit are crucial elements, and a bank typically goes for a run when it's unable to service its deposit, or it's seen to be under liquidity problems, where people are losing trust and more customers are not coming forth to put their deposits at the bank. So it's a trust issue. So what you as auditors you do is you actually look at how is the trust maintained, what kind of documentation happens, how do customers secure their interest in the brand. When you look at loans, what primarily auditors look at is classification. The most important part is how do you classify which account is an asset, which account is a substandard asset. How do you go through the process of identification of non-performing assets? And the most important part, the P&L part, is governed by how do you provide for non-performing assets? What are the governing processes which go into it? So when you do sample checks, the sample check actually should not be seen in isolation. You should see it as in conjunction with the overall integrated process to see detection of non-classified NPAs or under provision. What does it mean? Is it an isolated case, or are there linkages? And if those linkages point to systemic issues in the classification itself. As I mentioned, a simple auditor points out this asset is not a standard asset, you have classified as standard asset, you have underreported your P&L. This is very simple. The second level auditor goes through it to understand what went wrong with the process of identification and points out to the management that maybe there is a systemic lapse in it. And the second level auditor is who is more valued in the organization, in the bank, because he's giving most valuable advice to the bank or the insurance company. Looking at the agency functions, if you look at it, again, collection of checks, transfer of funds, these have become very routine now, and most of them have become electronic. So I won't like to dwell on it at this point of time. Let's move to the next. This is again a very humorous cartoon. I'm not saying this happens in banks and insurance companies, but I'm saying that, look at the cartoon, you can make out your own views about it. So as an auditor, your job becomes important to assume that evidence gathering is a very serious job, because not every employee in the company at the bottom, though the bank or the insurance at the top level is very, very concerned that everything is given openly to the auditors. At the bottom, there will be vested interest. And at the middle level, there will be vested interest. And then people, you see this left-hand side of the cartoon, can I keep this here before they come for audit? And then somebody says, we are going to need a bigger rug. So on the right-hand side, you see a very diligent auditor taking evidences very seriously, because every evidence is important. Sometimes very minor evidences actually translate into very major effects. Just to give you an example, a minor transaction error of a fixed deposit maturity amount being wrong. You find it in one case, and then you try to think that it is an isolated incident. But remember, this is computer era. It's a completely technologized era. What goes wrong in one transaction multiplies into several transactions. There could be a complete programming error, which might have resulted in that lapse. There could be a serious breach of the computer systems to selectively alter the program for certain fixed deposit maturities. And therefore, the larger question arises, who accesses the backend? What is the tenure of the employee who is accessing the backend? How long has that person been in that backend? Are there conflicts of interest between the guy attending to the backend in the IT program and the person in the sales field? So many questions come out of a simple maturity error in a fixed deposit. But then if you treat it as an isolated error, you will simply find the branch manager will say error rectified, issue closed. But then is the issue really closed? So taking evidences very seriously is very important in the banking sector, particularly because it is totally automated. So what happens in one transaction actually multiplies into several transactions, and then the effects could be large scale. Next. So what typically when you get audit functions or audit jobs in banks, what kind of audit jobs you get? The most primary job you get is actually a concurrent audit, which is a very, very basic audit, but it is a very important part because it happens continuously and it gives you an examination of the financial transaction at the time of happening. And why concurrent audit has been made mandatory by RBI is that it is to make sure that transactions happening between two balance sheet periods are also understood and evaluated, and any errors in the transactions are rectified and preventive. This is one part of the preventive risk management. The second most important part is the risk-based internal audit, which is the internal audit officer of the bank doing a complete audit of the branches and the process shops. And this is something which completely overviews the concurrent audit system also. In a way, the concurrent audit system is the efficacy of the concurrent audit system is seen by the internal audit. Then you see, and branch audit, I would say, is very similar. The branch audit is actually an audit. It just checks whether the efficacy of the branch is correct. But the internal audit is very different. Internal audit is a risk-based internal audit. It tries to see whether born out of the findings of the concurrent audit and the branch audit, what kind of root cause analysis is happening. So for example, I mentioned to you that example about the fixed deposit maturity amount being wrong. Another example I mentioned is, suppose an amount lying in the suspense account instead of going into the customer's account is lying for say 6 months. You think it is an isolated entry, but then is repeatedly similar amounts going into suspense and getting credited to the same customer account. That gives you a different idea. So suppose you went through the list of suspense accounts and you found that most of the transactions are getting credited to a single particular account. So this may be a very clever way of actually ensuring that the suspense account is wiped out before the balance sheet date and it gets credited to some customer's account. To wipe it off, on the 1st of July, again it reappears back into the suspense account. So preventive risk management is about root cause analysis, understanding system inefficiencies, and figuring out what is going wrong. Is it a breach? Is it a fraud? Or is it a computer programming error? Or is it an isolated incident? Statutory audit, most of you as chartered accountants will be doing this because every quarter the banks for their balance sheet try to do a statutory audit. This is largely external, and there you ensure you go through the books of accounts and you try to find out whether the profit and loss is correct, whether the statements are correct, whether the disclosures are correct, whether the contingent liabilities are correctly put. Contingent liabilities in terms of letters of credit, bank guarantees, are they correctly reflected? Whether the provisioning in non-performing assets is correct. See, in banks, most important part today has become identification of non-performing assets and the correct provisioning, because they have a direct correlation to the profit and loss account. So most auditors' responsibilities governs around that to find out whether there is any under provisioning or non-reporting of a substandard asset in the books. And I'll come to that in the coming slides. As we develop this banking part a little bit more in detail, I'll give you some examples of how this happens. Forensic audit is basically based on these audits. What kind of management decisions are taken? Is there a pattern to the errors and the decision-making process at the bank level? Are there systemic mistakes and lapses which point to organizational structural issues, conflict of interest, and then to understand a pattern between various decisions, connecting the errors. So you have an isolated fixed deposit payment maturity amount mistake, you have an isolated sundry deposit suspense account overdue, then you have an isolated case of a bank guarantee which has been worded wrongly, where the bank guarantee period is unlimited. So there is no limit to the liability. There is a typographical error, so to say, but it could be just be not a typographical error. Somebody has wantonly done that to benefit a customer who gets a bank guarantee which is unlimited in tenor, so that it has an unlimited liability. Normally, bank guarantees are limited to a period of 3 years, 2 years, etc. So all that is required is to make a small typographical error, and it would become unlimited, and the bank would be getting exposed to a long-term liability issue, which actually needs to be looked at. So systemic issues, management decisions, transfer policies, organizational structures, reporting. How does the organization report? Is there arm's length relationship between, say, risk department and operations department and sales? Is the arm's length relationship sufficient enough? These questions also get examined during the forensic audit. Next. So some special audits in banks happen, which you will be lucky to get if you are able to bring out those qualifications in you. One of that is the credit audit. And as I mentioned to you, in the bank, time and again, credit audit is the largest implication one. What do these people do basically? Credit audit is basically they try to examine the process of sanction, the process of post-sanction processes, the sanction of limits, sanction of excess drawings. So how are limits given? So what do they look at? Of course, the presentation wordings are there with you, but what I am trying to give you some insight is, suppose there is a loan account and you want to see how many times this loan has been renewed in the last 1 year, how many times it has been enhanced. Is enhancement and limit given post excess drawing? So excess drawing has happened, then you justify it by an enhancement and limit. Or is enhancement and limit a natural process of the turnover increasing? Is an excess drawing given in order to accommodate rising stocks? Is the stock rising due to obsolete stocks going up? Is an inventory going up of a particular item which is no longer marketable? So scrutiny of excess drawings, fund diversion. What do the bank statements reveal in the cash credit account? Do they show payments to particular vendors selectively more than others? Are there vendors who are not actually related at all to the activities of the firm? Are people shown as vendors who don't relate to the activity? These are very, very subtle and very intuitive examples of excess drawings or fund diversions, which means I'm showing my brother as a partner in a firm which has got nothing, which is in a mining activity, and I'm in a textile activity, and I'm paying that guy. It's an obvious opportunity to see for an auditor that something is going on. So don't look at transactions in isolation in credit audit. Always try to see linkages. You should see an account from all its perspectives. Suppose you are auditing credit and you're looking at ABC Limited. Try to see whether the ancillary accounts are also in the same bank. And if so, are there letters of credit getting devolved and reopened again and again? You know the classic case of devolving letters of credit, which are paid by another letter of credit reopened. So this part, and then disbursement process in term loans. Are disbursement processes phased out or they are given in one shot? And if they're given in one shot, how is the disbursal monitored? Is the disbursal going towards the end use? How is end use of funds being monitored? Friends, in credit audit in the banking industry, the most important part is end use of funds. I have given a loan for a particular activity. Is the end use being properly monitored? That is number one. Number two, you try to see is that are the stocks based on which the cash credit is sanctioned, is the stock actually slow moving, fast moving, or is it any more marketable? What is the firm's turnover? If the turnover is declining and the cash credit limit is enhancing, obviously there are issues there. Again, in bank guarantees, when you look at bank guarantees, look at what are the underlying transaction. Is the bank guaranteeing a transaction which is directly reflected in the memorandum and articles of the company's association, or is it reflecting an activity which is nothing to do with the bank, with the company at all? So while a bank guarantee limit has been sanctioned at the apex level, it's not necessary that every transaction of the bank guarantee which is happening at the field officer level is necessarily of the company's activity. That part can get manipulated at the ground level. And in LCs, when you look at letters of credit, you look at who's the counterparty. Don't look at only the client who you're auditing. Always have your eyes on who's the counterparty. And then you have your social media knowledge, you have your credit bureau knowledge. You try to investigate outside how's the counterparty doing, because the counterparty's conduct has a lot to say on the credit disposal of this particular client. So you're auditing ABC and letter of credit is opened on XYZ. It is always a good practice for you as auditors. XYZ may not be banking with that bank at all, but still it is a good practice for you to see what is that XYZ doing, what is its credit rating, what is its market, what are its activities, and try to bring linkages. Most good breaches are found by good auditors. Good auditors are able to find breaches not based on isolated transaction. They are able to find linkages. They don't look at a transaction singularly, particularly financial transaction banking industry. They don't look at it singularly. They try to relate it to multiple transactions. Next. And then you would have seen recently that RBI has not allowed multiple current account opening for cash credit accounts. And the purpose. Cash credit account is a method to disperse funds to vendors, suppliers, etc. But a current account is used for only remittance management. But recently, a lot of frauds and fund diversions have happened through current accounts and not through cash credit accounts. So you have a cash credit account in ABC Bank, but you open a current account with multiple banks and multiple cooperative banks, under the guise that I need those current accounts for managing local needs, which you are not able to fulfill. So what happens is the current account becomes the source of diversion. So you will find in a cash credit account debits happening and the credits all going to some current account. So you will say it has reached a dead end. I can't find out. There is no vendor, supplier, anything. And all the vendor and supplier payment is happening through the current account in the other bank. So you don't have any idea about who are the vendors and suppliers to which the cash credit is used for. So end use of funds, you can't find out at all, because the end use is saying credit current account ABC Cooperative Bank. But as part of credit audit, you have the right to call for the current account statements of those banks to see ultimately, finally, where is this money going for? Is it going for the intended purpose? Of course, because it was becoming very difficult to manage and because of the private banks competition, most of the current accounts started getting used for fund diversion. That is why now RBI has come back and said that current accounts, opening of multiple current accounts will not be permitted and they have to be immediately closed. So, policy wise, they came with a view because they found it difficult even through the process of audit to actually track and eliminate such kind of frauds. Yeah, next slide. I'll come to one element of the stock audit. I mentioned to you about slow moving stocks and whether the inventory against which you are giving the bank is giving drawings is actually a slow moving stock or a fast moving stock. So here you will find that stock audit becomes necessary because I am not too sure that my security, which is my current asset, is actually really a current asset. It could be a complete non-current asset because the stocks that are on hand are slow moving. During COVID times also, this is very important to do stock audits, because to understand not just whether there is pilferage in the stock, whether the stock statement given is actually in line with the actual stock. That is one part. But that is a very simpler part. The more important part is to do aging analysis of the stocks and to see whether the stocks are moving. A cash credit account in a bank can remain a standard asset only if the stock is also moving. If it is not moving, the cash credit account cannot remain a standard asset. Even technically speaking, it may remain a standard asset. You will always find drawings to the brim. It's always against the drawing power, the full limit is utilized. Technically, no excess drawing. But what are you hypothecating? You are hypothecating assets which can never be liquidated. At some point of time, you will find that the cash credit is to the brim, but workers are not paid salaries for 6 months, or sundry debtors are not being paid, or sundry creditors have not been paid. So that gives you an indication, while drawings have happened fully in this account and there is no excess drawing, the company has not been able to pay several of its creditors. So that shows that the stock is not moving and the receivables are also not forthcoming. So one of the very important part is not just stock audit. We do stock audit as well as receivable audit. And many times auditors are engaged for this job because bank wants to be convinced about continuing the cash credit limit or enhancing the cash credit limit. And for that purpose, they want to be sure that the stocks are current and they are moving and the receivables are liquid and they can be received back. So for this purpose, banks themselves, I have been in the credit department in the bank. I have noticed that whenever we find that customers come very frequently for excess drawing or customers come very frequently for enhancement and limits, we generally go through a stock audit to find out whether actually am I lending against liquid stocks and am I lending against moving receivables. Yeah, next. Next, please. So as I mentioned, in the bank, the highest level of audit is a management audit. So management audit has a very large function. As auditors, you'll be really lucky if you are given assignments of management audit because they are really the cream of the audit jobs, because it is a governance audit, really speaking. So governance audit means typically you evaluate the structure of the organization. You see whether there are banking transactions, how they are governed by, what kind of policies are used, how does the regulatory policy blend into the board policy, and how does the board policy blend into the standard operating process. If you notice the first slide, I mentioned that. So this management audit is typically trying to see whether organizational structure has the desired efficacy to create economic value for the bank and to minimize risk and put in place a preventive risk management policy. How good is the management structure to organize itself for root cause analysis, for critical incident reporting? How does the management react to critical incidents? What are the past critical incidents and how has the bank responded to it? These many questions. And then management audit is very interestingly even on sales efficiency, process efficiency, what kind of Six Sigma processes are adopted in the company, what kind of modern practices are adopted by the company to do preventive risk management. So these are very many functions of management audit. I have been on the receiving end of a management audit at some point in time in my career, and it was very interesting because it is not about bit picking, but it really gives you valuable lessons on how to improve the efficiency of your organization. Next. To a large extent, management audit is also forward looking. You try to give the bank an idea as to the next 3 years, how your bank's balance sheet will be, what are the likely risks that you will be faced with, and what are the organizational policies, HR policies, which you may have to implement in order to benefit the future earnings of the bank. Next. Let me come to now some very simple things. What are the major risk areas in banks? Because so far I covered it at a slightly higher level. Now let's see what kind of typical areas which we come across in banking sector and what are the remedies for that. Next. So let's go by input to output. The most important is identity of the customer, which is what is the KYC risk. So basically KYC risk you are mitigating as an auditor by checking sample audits of documents given at the time of bank account opening. What is the integrity of the documents? And the most important document is obviously know your customer identification documents. Of course, today Aadhaar card has come as a very big benefit, but then whether barcoded Aadhaar cards are used or paper photocopy Aadhaar card forms are used, even this small thing can make a lot of difference. Photocopies, no verifiability. Barcode based electronic digital account opening identification, huge benefit. It gives greater integrity to the account opening process. Money laundering, anti-money laundering is also one of the major risks in banks. I'll give you a small example. Suppose you're doing a transaction audit and you are given typically all the accounts with high value transactions. The immediate provocation for any auditor in the bank when you go is you say, show me all your high value accounts. I would give you one tip. ask for the low value bank accounts. Why? Because as part of the sample, if you have some low value bank accounts, you will be surprised to see some high value transactions creeping into a low value bank account. So then, and it will disappear before the Friday, the reporting Friday, or the month end, or the quarter end. So this is a very good indication. Technically, zero balance accounts, but with surprisingly high value transactions. So why I mentioned this side by side is that when you are looking at AML, the typical thing is to look at a policy and look at a few transactions and then feel that everything is fine. But then many of the surprise elements, you must have the knack of looking at the wrong end of the stick. You must be able to see what really is not being shown to you. So people will come and give you readily accounts. Your sample check, they will know how to predict. But then to look at frauds in money laundering, you'll have to look at it differently. Similarly, source of funds. Where is the money coming from? What kind of funds are coming from? Are there unnecessarily, compared to the occupation of the customer, is the transaction coming into the account unduly different, unduly large? So relationship between the profile of the customer and the transaction happening in the account is very, very important, because you are able to see very important linkages when you compare something with something. If you look at isolatedly 10 lakh rupees in an account, nothing, it doesn't make any meaning to you. But suppose you see 10 lakh in an account and the profile of the customer is something like a wage laborer. Obviously, it gives you a lot of indication as to what is going wrong. Integrity of transaction. When I say integrity of transaction, what I mean is that are transactions reflecting the purpose, and is there accuracy of the computation of the interest and the income? Very basic. Are deposit interest being correctly calculated? Are cash credit interest being correctly calculated? So these are programmed. These are programmed into the system, but are they really programmed in a systematic way? Are there income breaches? Are there income losses you are locating? Especially in a computerized world is very, very nice. Even if you look at one transaction mistake in a computerized world, I believe there could be hundreds of transactions which are affected. I'll give you an example. Suppose somebody came to put this as an insurance example, but then it's very similar. Somebody came to me and said, I paid 1 lakh rupees premium and my fund value is only 40,000. So then I found that 50,000 rupees was in the suspense account in the bank. Then I figured out that this 50,000 was not getting adjusted into the premium account for some programming mistake. So this is a very classic example that if this is one transaction, how many more transactions can be there like this? So any breach in the normal SOP you see in a computerized world, it gives you alert as to how many more repeat transactions like this could be there. Then system input and output. Fundamentally, the basic is to see what is the input given and whether the output is exactly as per the policy of the bank. So suppose it is cash credit, suppose it is bank guarantee. Is the output exactly coming out as per the policy of the bank? Is the bank guarantee wording exactly as per what is permitted by the board policy and by the regulation? So always when you look at system input or output, you look at the wordings in the document which is coming out as an output. Call for sample input, sample output. And the key is actually selection of the samples, as I mentioned to you about low value savings bank accounts. Similarly, in bank guarantees, you can find innocuous bank guarantees of very small value customers. But suppose in that bank guarantee that the wordings of the bank guarantee indicate something to you, which gives you a horror story. For example, I told you that it could be an unlimited tenor bank guarantee. Maybe it is a small amount, but it gives you indication that there is some programming defect where sometimes the wording that comes out is different from the wording that comes out in the standard way. And I'll explain to you why that happens. Because not everything when you see in a computerized world is perfect. There are a lot of change requests. There are a lot of change corrections which happen in the back end of IT program systems. There is no IT system in the world which is completely operated on the front end. There are change requests. There are things which go wrong, which are corrected through the back end. So there lies the vulnerability of the IT system, that somebody in the back end can go and correct a particular part which is not obeying the overall program. So fixed, say let us say recurring deposit, at the end of 7 years, the maturity amount should be thrown out. But in one case, it is throwing out at the end of 6 years. So that one case could be a breach. So somebody goes and corrects it, saying that there's a small programming defect. The question is, the person who corrects it has access to Please remember, he has access to correction means he has access to even doing something else wrong. He could either do it deliberately or he could do unconsciously. So backend corrections always keep happening. That's why system input and output matching and verification is very, very critical. Cybersecurity is a very large subject. I will come to you in the next few slides as to cover it in a generic way. Cybersecurity is very common with this banking, insurance, BFSI sector is very, very generic. And cybersecurity is about data privacy, data accuracy, consistency, scalability, and integrity. Identification of NPAs and provisions I mentioned to you in the previous slides. Office accounts, all kinds of office accounts. What is their aging? What is the repetitiveness of the transaction? Are you saying sundry accounts, sundry deposit, suspense account of a particular variety only every time? This quarter you came for an audit, next quarter you came for it, you still found the same kind of sundry deposit suspense account. So it gives you a suspicion whether there is a process issue or whether there is a particular pattern to crediting these or debiting these, reversing these entries by debit or credit to particular accounts. So then it gives you a clue as to what is going wrong. So always, as I mentioned to you, reversal, how the reversal of an office account is happening is more important to an auditor than actually seeing what are the amounts. So writing a rudimentary statement that so many entries are there, so much is more than 90 days, more than 120 days, doesn't serve the purpose. What serves the purpose is so many entries were reversed. And when they were reversed by debit or credit to this particular account. And we could see commonality in the reversal process. Overdue payments from creditors, overdue payments to vendors, debtors. Again, it is not so routine to say simply giving aging analysis. What is important to see is who are the creditors. If there is regular overdue payment from creditors, who are those types of creditors who are willing to wait for 180 days, 240 days? So what's going wrong in the process of the company? Are bills getting stuck? Are bills not in conformity due to which bills get delayed? Or are bills getting manipulated? Credit related risk, I spoke to you at length about it. Forex rules, exchange control regulations are very, very elaborate. They belong to country. So Forex remittances, imports, exports, receipt of money, are they exactly following the FEMA guidelines, the FERA guidelines? A lot of liberalization has happened on the trust that the banks will monitor the guidelines properly. So in the guidelines have been liberalized, it is presumed that the banks will do the correct part. So Forex rules, again, reading the exchange control manual, reading the Forex rules before you go for an audit is very important. There are specialized Forex audits these days. If you're fortunate to get to participate in one of them, then you will get a lot of knowledge about the capital control guidelines, what kind of money can go abroad, for what purpose it can go abroad, and then finding out whether there are any loopholes in that. Again, taking positions, forward contracts. How are the forward contracts entered into? What kind of agreements are enforced? What do the agreements state? What are the agreements? When you take out samples, read the agreement to see whether they actually reflect what was prescribed. Because even a small wording change can expose the bank to a legal suit. Last important point is very important. Major risk. You can find all these sample of issues from customer complaints, frauds, income leakage incidents reported to the board, and critical incidents. The last item alone, if you read first when you go to an audit, you will get to know how to do sampling. The trick is in sampling. If you know to do the right sampling, I bet you can find out many things. So to do the right sampling, there is evidence available. Every company has past karma. Every bank, every insurance company has past karma. You read the karma of that entity to find out what went wrong in this company earlier, or what went wrong in the bank earlier, what went wrong with this corporate account earlier, how was that rectified, what root cause analysis was done. That will give you a lot of idea as to what actions were taken, how employees were penalized, and what kind of HR policy changes took place, what kind of other policy changes happened in order to mitigate that complaint from recurring. Again, concurrent audit reports and repetitive errors. Same types of errors in multiple audit reports also gives you a good signal. I would always say that the last point is very good for you, because you're not going to go and do an audit of a startup. You're mostly going to go and do an audit of a relatively company. If you're doing a first time audit, obviously all the points that I mentioned matter. But if you're doing an audit of a company, of a bank which is already audited, the last is enough for you. It gives you enough idea as to how to do sampling. And as I mentioned in the previous cartoon, how an auditor takes a sniffer dog and sniffs. If you know this, you know how to do the right sampling. I bet you will never you'll always be able to come with some very, very intelligent observation when you do an audit. Next. So what are the key governance ratios to watch for apart from audit? So one is audit at a grassroots level, but there are certain governance ratios which indicate. So before you go to an audit, you see the balance sheet of the bank. Interest income is coming down, loans are turning NPAs, declining interest expenses, not able to service debt. Clear problem, symptomatic problem in the balance sheet of the bank. So always it's a good habit, even if you are being assigned only a concurrent audit of a branch, it's good to know the bank, to know what is the balance sheet of the bank. How is the bank's balance sheet turning? Is the interest income going up? Is the interest expenses coming down? What is the kind of interest earned versus expended ratio? Next. So the credit to deposit ratio is a very critical component. Ideally, we don't exceed 70 to 80%. But then if the deposit ratio is overlent, either it means that money lent has not come back, but you're continuing to overlend because you have to service your depositors. So in order to service your depositors, interest not paid on past accounts is compensated by fresh loans. So this is actually a very good indicator to see whether the bank is self-sufficient and whether there will be a future run on a bank. Next. Next. This is a very interesting. It is a measure of the difference between the interest income earned by a bank and the interest it pays to the lender. So this NIM, net interest income, is a measure of the profitability. It's an indirect measure of the profitability, and it is a very good milestone. You see this graph. This is typical of a bank where there is a red alert that the interest margins have come down sharply. This could be because assets are not paying you enough, so you're overlent on assets, or it could be that you are dependent highly on high cost deposits. So this kind of gives you an idea when you go that there is a strain on the bank, and therefore the bank is likely to be very belligerent in its lending policy because they are borrowing at 6.5%, 7%, 8% from public at a high cost. They are forced to lend to high risk sectors, say building, construction, and therefore you will be on watch to see that in this bank maybe I should do identification of credit side is more important for me to know whether I am actually overexposed to a particular sector of advances, or am I taking high risk advances in order to repay my depositors? Next. So gross NPA and net NPA, very interesting, friends. Gross NPA means the total asset which is under strain, and net NPA is minus the provision. So every quarter you make provisions, and then the extent of provision you have made, you are actually suppressing the profit and loss comes down to that extent. If there is no difference, for example, between gross NPA and net NPA, what does it mean? It means you're under providing. It's a very direct indication to you that the bank is not providing enough for the NPA, and it is not staggering the profit and loss. So what will happen in this kind of scenarios? One sudden balance sheet date, you'll find a huge provisioning being made, all of a surprise without any indication to anybody, and the profit will slump. And then immediately you'll find that people lose trust in the bank and there is a run on the bank. All those issues start happening. So the gross NPA to net NPA difference, how does it scale? It is not unnatural for a bank to have an NPA, but how does it treat its NPA? How does it report the NPA? How does it make provisioning? And more important, when you check samples of provisioning, try to see what is the process followed for provisioning. Is it a collective decision making for provisioning, or is it a one man decision of provisioning? So these things give you an indication as to whether the provisioning part is a more elaborated decisioning of the bank, or is it a one man decision? And what is the process of internal audit of provisioning? Very, very important, friends, because in the bank, this is the most important aspect of banking audit. Identification of NPAs and provisioning of NPAs. Next. I move now to the subject in which last 15 years I have been in the insurance sector now. So I completed with you what typically banking audit is about and what kind of issues come up. Insurance is simple. If you look at insurance, it is a very, very regulated industry, number one. And there, why? Because insurance is an industry where a customer pays premium for 10 years, 15 years, and money is repaid when either the customer is much, much older, he doesn't even remember the benefits that were promised to him at the time of taking the policy, or he's no more, and his nominees are only receiving the claim. They don't know what the old man was promised when he bought the policy. This is the peculiarity. And that is why world over insurance industry is highly regulated, because trust has to be built in customers over a very long period of time. And that is why the typical insurance risks, the first one on the top you are seeing is a valuation risk. Valuation risk means in insurance, the premium that is paid is used in the first year primarily for expenses and for distribution, income, and commission. It is only after the second and the third year that that policy starts giving revenue to the insurance company. Therefore, first year premium goes largely into expense management. The second, third year onwards, it remains. So the question is, how do you evaluate a policy? So how do you predict the future cash flow of a particular policy is what is valuation. The second thing is, valuation about valuation is how do you predict death? Most important part of the insurance industry is I price a product based on my prediction about mortality. Now, how do I predict death? Classic case is COVID. COVID upset most valuations because nobody knew that an epidemic of this size would come. But if insurance companies have been conservative and have been providing for such contingencies over a period of years, then a one odd bad year doesn't affect valuation so much. But still, many companies struggled with valuation, but then not much. Insurance industry has survived back, and this year you're seeing most of the companies again reporting back into the black. So valuation risk is what actuarial science is. You'll find actuarials are like scientists in manufacturing companies. Nobody knows how they price, how do they value, but then that is the most scientific part. That is the heart of the industry. And what is valued is what is underwritten. You see in the left hand side underwriting risk. So what is valued is what is underwritten. If I underwrite different from the way I actually provide for, then I might be either very liberal in accepting policies or very conservative in accepting policies. So the actuarial department lays down the ground rules of underwriting, and based on which the underwriters underwrite policies. You see process risk. Now the process risk, I'll just quickly complete that, because process risk is the most important part, because it is selection of the right customers. We don't give insurance to everybody. We subject them to financial underwriting. We subject them to medical underwriting in order to make sure that the correct people are not over-insured. Two things have to be taken care of. If I insure unhealthy people, or if I insure people disproportionate to their income, I will be doing injustice to the other customers, because insurance is a pool concept. The entire customers are pooled. So if I do anti-selection, I will do just injustice to many other customers who have come healthily into the pool. So unhealthy customers will eat into the pool of the profitable customers. It is the job of the insurance company to make sure that there is no anti-selection, and the pool is fairly reflective of similar segment of income and health. So two things are primarily underwritten in insurance. One is income and health. Income is underwritten to see how many times multiple I can give sum assured, and health is underwritten to see whether the customer will live for the desired period of the term. And that is why selection of customer is important. Appropriateness of product is very important, because I want my customer to pay his renewal premium right through his life, because as I mentioned to you, the first year premium goes towards expenses. It is the continuous premium payment which makes it profitable for the customer as well as to the insurance company. So if I don't give the appropriate product, the customer will stop paying the premium. If you stop paying the premium, the persistency of the company will fall. If you see in insurance industry, you see persistency is a very important part. 13th month, 25th month, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year. So companies with very good persistency levels indicate that they have selected appropriate products to the customers. Persistency is a natural reflection of appropriation of products. And the last one is the transaction integrity. Transaction integrity is very similar to the banking industry, whether you have paid the maturity properly, whether the maturity amount is correct, whether the claim amount is correct, whether the payment of claim amount is correct, whether you have selected the process properly for payment, have you adjudicated the claim properly. These things are part of the transaction. Any financial transaction in the BFSI sector, whether it's bank or insurance company, is very similar. Suppose a customer comes for surrender. Is a surrender value properly calculated? How is it fed into the computer programming? Who validates that? How is the backend programming validated? These kind of questions come into transaction integrity. Cyber security in InfoSec, I will cover it separately in a separate slide, but there is a separate slide on IT because it is generic to banking and insurance industry. Brand image, as I mentioned to you, insurance industry is about brand, because how LIC is built a brand. It has built a brand over 60 years because of payment of claims. 99% claims are paid, they say. So that is a very good indication of brand image. And that's why we say early claims are to be avoided. Early claims generally go for repudiation, because it means that your selection was not correct, or customer did not disclose his health properly, or you failed to verify his health properly. So companies typically fix non-medical limits, medical limits. So the appropriateness of the non-medical limit and the medical limit is based on the actuarial valuation. So actuarial pricing, their formula, and they decide how much will be medical and how much will be non-medical. The test of efficacy of that is seen in the kind of claims which come. If too many early claims are coming, it either means that customer disclosure is not appropriate, or the distributor is not asking the right questions to the customer, or my medical grid is too liberal. Suppose I'm giving, say, 5 crores plus everybody non-medical based on customer disclosure. I'm trusting the customer and giving. Many of the claims, if they happen early claims, then it gives me an indication that something is wrong with my underwriting grid, or with my selection process, or with my distributor training. Early claims are a huge drain to insurance companies. Next. So I also mentioned the regulatory risk. Regulatory risk is, you have to file a product. Unlike banking industry, here every insurance product has to be filed with the regulator. You file with the regulator the pricing, the term, the minimum age, the maximum age, the maturity, the surrender value, everything. And then only after the regulator approves you are supposed to use the product. The communication, the advertisement is also filed with the regulator. Only the filed advertisement can be used. And the filed advertisement has a benefit illustrator which shows what is the average minimum benefit and the maximum benefit. And it's an illustration to the customer to be given only in that format. And that is why regulatory risk is very high in this industry, because you cannot violate anything, because everything is laid down. Very little discretion is available in this process. Regulation lays down the process of filing products, the process of pricing the products, the process of underwriting the process of even reinsurance. How much reinsurance should an insurance company go for? Many of these things are laid down by the regulatory policies. So therefore, friends, when you go for insurance audits, it will be very nice for you to understand the regulatory process of insurance industry, because that gives you a very good handle on how to do audits and understand the context of insurance company when you go for audits. Next. Typical micro risks in insurance, so that you get a handle on how it works. So again, as I mentioned, KYC AML risk, very common, very similar to banks. Source of funds is very important here, friends, because in insurance, I cannot insure you. You have to insure yourself. So if I'm insuring you, I have a vested interest in your life, which means there is a threat to your life. So source of funds, who is paying the premium for whose policy, is very, very critical for us. And whether the premium being paid is out of earned income or is it out of a lottery. There's a lot of difference. I may get a lottery of 10 lakhs and I may decide to buy an insurance policy. It's not an earned income. I am not having the capability to earn that income. So therefore, I may be over-insuring myself. So over-insurance is a risk which is detected through source of fund identification. Also anti-selection. Typically brother insuring his brother, not acceptable, because the interest is on his own life. A husband, a person has an interest on his own life. A third party cannot have an interest on the other person's life. So there are some, for example, but then there are some deviations. Employer can have an interest in an employee's life because there is a commercial relationship established. Therefore, source of funds is very important. Accuracy of underwriting, whether the underwriting rules are exactly as per the reinsurance treaty, whether as is as per the regulatory policy, and whether it bears out with the claims experience. So process and consistency of underwriting, you take samples of underwriting and check whether the underwriting is as per the grid in the system, grid prescribed by the actuaries. Claim payment accuracy, whether maturity is paid at the correct date, whether the payment, whether a death claim when it comes, whether the investigation, in all LD claims, we do investigation to find out whether there was a non-disclosure. So whether the evaluation of non-disclosure is proper. Another thing they see is conflict of interest. Suppose independent medical checkup, whether it happens through a third-party administrator. What is the commercial relationship between me in the insurance company and the third-party administrator? What kind of fee structure is there? Is it appropriate? So that the independence of the medical examination is maintained. It's very, very critical for us. Or is the TPA administered by a sales department? For example, if the third-party administration of medicals is run by the sales department of the insurance company, you can see the conflict of interest very clearly, because a sales guy will be interested in his commission, and therefore he is likely to underwrite all the policies to his favor. Claims process accuracy, customer grievance, as I mentioned again in the previous slides, customer complaints and regulatory violations are very, very important symptoms for you to know what are the root causes, and from there you can pick up samples. So customer grievance can be either mis-selling complaints or it could be service issues. Any of these things will give you a very good idea about what is going wrong in the systems and processes of the company. Suppose you see a very high level of mis-selling complaint, it will give you an indication that the training of the distributors is not appropriate, or the communication with the distributors using to give to the customer at the time of point of sale is different from the approved literature filed with the regulators. As I mentioned to you, every product, every advertisement is filed to the regulator. So is the advertisement misleading, due to which a complaint is coming? Is that advertisement filed with the regulator or not filed? Or is it in deviation to the filed thing with a small typographical error, 4% is made a 5%? So these kind of things are checked to make sure that there is no conflict of interest, and therefore checking customer grievance is very important. Turnaround time is also checked to make sure that the process efficiency is important, because if an insurance company is not able to service its customers properly in time, then you can imagine the trust in the brand will come down. And typically insurance companies have to grow in volume, because volume, see, insurance is a law of large numbers. Actuarial science is predictions, and its accuracy largely depends on the law of large numbers. So as companies grow, the predictions become better. So in order to grow, you need a brand, you need trust. So large number of customer grievances, very large number of very early claims are indications that the company's growth path is stifled, and therefore it may not be able to service the existing customers nor grow its customers, and therefore the size of the basket is likely to remain small. And if the size of the basket is small, then you are likely to have predictions going wrong. Persistency, as I mentioned, renewal premiums are coming in time. Why there is lapsation? Are there lapsation symptoms? So when you do sampling of persistency, check which products are creating more lapsation. Don't just look at lapsation symptomically, look at linkages. Which kind of customer base is giving you lapsation? Are there certain occupation profiles which are creating more lapsation? So root cause analysis gives an indication for you to give advice to the board at the end of their audit period when you give summary findings. There are formal reports that you submit. There are informal findings also you tell. Most of the organizations ask for some informal reports also as to what your understanding about the job that you did. From there, they get valuable inputs as to how their employee training has to be improved, how their employee transfer policy has to be improved, how the reward recognition and motivation processes have to be improved. Many things come out during the audit, friends. Audit is not only about finding mistakes. Audit is a lot about giving valuable input and feedback, which actually helps in building the motivation and the longevity of the organization. Early and very early death claims. So typically very early death claim is a claim which occurs within 1 year of the policy. And very early death claim is typically considered it's a big alert. An early claim is something which is occurring within 3 years. Typically, if a claim crosses 3 years, then the claim is paid without much of investigation, because it is considered as a normal death. So it is paid off. But where the death is happening within the first 3 years or the first 1 year, there is investigation to see whether there was non-disclosure, or despite the best of disclosure, death happened in a natural course within the first year, which is perfectly possible. But then what is to be seen is what is the underlying process of adjudication of early and very early death claims. Are they simply paid off? If I pay all the claims and show 99% claim payment, what's the point? Then people will take me for a ride. Prospective customers will know in this company claims are paid, so I will not disclose anything and my claim will definitely get paid. You will have a run on the insurance company sooner or later. So it's very important that the risk mitigation processes are followed in such a way that neither the distributor nor the customer nor the employee can shortchange the company. Office accounts I mentioned there, and here also policy deposit, premium which is not adjusted are typically office accounts issues. Anything not going into the premium account is a risk to the company, because any claim that arises before the money gets into the premium account and it is lying in the office account cannot be debited to the policy fund of the insurer. It has to go to the P&L, which is a very serious issue. So for a public listed company, a shareholder will ask, why have we paid a claim which was not payable because it is not adjusted to the premium of the account, but it was lying in a sundry deposit for falana reason, because it was short of requirements or whether the money was not properly adjusted. Mis-selling complaints, service complaints, claim repudiation. It gives you a very good idea about what kind of claims get repudiated. Claim repudiation is normally for an insurance company. Ideally speaking, the ratio should be very small because it directly hits on the brand and trust of the organization. Next. Come to that IT audit. I mentioned about banking earlier, but IT audit in insurance or banking is one and the same, because IT is IT. So let's see what generic issues you can look at. The main thing, if you look at, is of course it comes under the overall ISO 27000 framework. But integrity test, which is access protocols, what are the access protocols available to access the systems, which is user ID, password, how often the passwords are changed, how the predictability of the password is prevented, how do you make sure, and now more modern methods are coming, face recognition, biometrics are coming. So how is the company modernizing its access protocols? Logical access, default rights. How does the company maintain log of the change? So how many times this employees change the password? Which, when an employee went on a mandatory 9-day leave in an organization, was he able to access the systems? Logically speaking, he's not supposed to access any system during the mandatory leave period. So that 9-day period is an available period for the organization to know if any employee has committed any fraud or any mistake and covered it up, so that those 8 to 9 days, every organization, banks, insurance companies have a mandatory leave system. So during that time, was he able to access? What kind of breaches have happened in the system? That is what is called as change management. Backend changes, I mentioned to you, change requests, corrections in the system, which cannot be done through the front end, are done through the back end, which means it leaves vulnerability. Every system has a back-end correction process, but then how is that back-end correction process carried out? What are the double checks in the system to ensure that an employee sitting in the back end of the IT doesn't manipulate the system to his convenience, because back-end vulnerability is very dangerous. So, and then the entry flow between core systems, the finance system, the policy management system, the HR system, are these systems talking to each other, or they are isolated? If they're isolated, there is room for arbitration and there is room for arbitrage by employees or distributors, because they know that the core system doesn't talk to X system. The HR system doesn't know. For example, as an employee, I sold a policy in Dehradun. I got transferred to Rohtak, and in Dehradun, my customers complained. But the HR system does not recognize the policy mapped to Dehradun to Rohtak. So I get promoted in Rohtak, because the HR system did not recognize that this person was, when he was in Dehradun, he sold policies which were missold, and therefore he should not be promoted despite a spectacular performance in Rohtak. So when the systems don't talk, this kind of vulnerabilities happen. Data security protocols. Data security protocol, you all know about breach of data, privacy laws are coming. So for example, simplest thing I'll tell you, you go through an email of an employee to see what kind of external emails come to him, what kind of emails go from him to external IDs. If you check the email IDs of most of the IT people in the backend, or the people who handle the backend of the company, who have access to large MIS data, large customer data, who are the people who have access to large data? What access do they have to emails? How many mails come to them from external IDs? How many mails go? A very simple process is, somebody who was in a backend of an IT system, there was a mail which went to a Gmail ID. And then later on, it was found that that Gmail ID, that attached, the mail had an attachment of a set of customer data. This is a very classic example of how you can trace whether customer data, what kind of attachments go. Particularly, don't look at the mail. I could be writing Diwali greetings to an external Gmail ID, but that's not important. What is important? What kind of attachments are going? If it is saying Diwali greetings and hi, and then there is an attachment of a set of 1,000 customers, then there's a data security issue. So you must intelligently look at data security protocols and see what kind of breaches are possible. MIS system strength. How much MIS comes out of the system directly? How much MIS comes out because you have to take a dump from the system and manipulate the dump to create the Excel? The more such dumps are to be created from the system to manipulate by outsiders into Excel, creating fields to the customization, it is good. Every company needs MIS as per, every employee needs, every department needs MIS as per what they require. But the more such customized MISs are created out of dumps from the system, the more arbitrage is available for manipulation of the systems, because at his disposal is a large set of data. But if MIS systems are programmed, and programmed systems are giving you access to data on a portal where you can't download it into your laptop, then that is the strength of the company. So MIS system strength is a very, very good way of actually reverse checking cybersecurity. Most of cybersecurity problems come from MIS systems. Next. So I come to a very specialized field, actuarial audit. It is a special science. To the extent I know, I will say this. I don't know how much I know about this, but to the extent I've understood. Because coming from banking to insurance, one of the things I try to understand is this is an assumptions-based science, and there's a lot of mathematics involved in it, and the accuracy of pricing is tested by the accuracy of the prediction of claims. And the accuracy of pricing is tested by the persistency of the policy and the appropriateness of sale process. So therefore, actuarial science goes by past experience, takes the industry experience, extrapolates, and then they try to arrive at the right price for each product, right premium for each age band. And at the end of every quarter, every half year, every year, the actuarial team actually provides for the reserves. After anticipating how much death claims will come, how many people will drop out of the policy premature, surrender their policy based on experience, and then appropriately they will provide for the reserves, and then the profit and loss will be created. That is why in insurance companies, friends, it is not so much P&L, it is the value of new business that matters. So value of new business is the prediction of the present value of the future cash flows. So prediction of the present value of the future cash flow means you must have a very good estimate of how the future cash flow will come. What is the future cash flow? The premium coming from the customer and the outgo in the form of maturity and in the form of death claims. So the right prediction of the future cash flow is a science, and it is a statistical science. It is based on trends of the past. It is based on economic conditions. It is based on the mortality rates. For example, now you would have seen in the newspapers, many companies are changing their product pricing for term products. They are pricing it heavy, and they are also making underwriting standards stiff. Why? Because COVID has changed mortality assumptions in a big way, and therefore this kind of conservative pricing has started happening because reinsurers are now not becoming very cagey about term products, and they want to make sure that the term products are appropriately made available to the right customers only. Next. So actuarial audit is a very detailed science. There are peer level audits. There are peer actuaries who audit another actuarial, and they try to assess the accuracy of the provisioning, because insurance balance sheets depend on the accuracy of the provisioning. It should not be too conservative. If it is too conservative, the pricing of the product may be very uncompetitive. You may be too high priced. People may not buy. And if it is very liberal, then you can imagine that you will have a lot of problems in the future. So it is the appropriateness of the provisioning which is checked. So the full scope of the actuarial audits are very, very different. They don't replicate the consulting actuary's valuation, but they use a sampling of the plan's participant to test the results of the valuation. And reserve methodology, what is the interplay between the planned provision and the assumption? And then we also give annuity products, pension products. So here it's the reverse. It is not about mortality. It is about longer life. If more and more people live very long, then the annuity products become less profitable. So therefore, on one extreme is life insurance products with mortality. On the other hand is the annuity products, which are lifelong pension up to 90 years, 90 years, 88 years. So there are different types of products which come. And then nowadays you get products on the mortality side also with products with maturity age up to 80, 85. So where death is almost certain. But still those products are available in the market for estate planning. So solvency margin, you see that last line, I'll just leave that at this. Solvency margin is an indicator of the health of the insurance company. Usually good insurance companies have a healthy solvency margin. Solvency margin is actually prescribed by the regulation, and you are supposed to have that minimum solvency margin, and anything more than that is even better. But too much of a solvency margin is indirectly detrimental to shareholders because you have too much of capital, and therefore return on capital becomes less. So it is the appropriateness of the solvency margin which is very, very important. And that is why the key play is pricing, underwriting, claim payment. These are the three hearts of the insurance industry. The rest is transactional, very similar to banking industry. But in the insurance company, these three verticals play a very different role than the banking industry. They play a role very akin to credit in banking. But credit is still short term. This is much more long term. And in credit, you predict based on economic scenario, industry scenario, etc. Here, there is no prediction because you have to go by the generic health of the country. What are the health standards? How they are developing? In fact, I would say that going forward, post-COVID situation, the health awareness of people may go up. More people are coming and asking for term products. So situations are changing. So actuaries also will look at how the health standards are going up, and appropriately, things will change as we go along. Next. Come to some last few slides. So this is a very good cartoon. What do you make out of it? That somebody has a bandage on his head, fracture on his hand, and then he gives a risk assessment. So maybe next time you will hand over the risk assessment to me on time. So that's a very good indication that do most of our audits show errors after they have occurred, or do they also prescribe root cause analysis in such a way that in future those errors don't happen? Something else may happen. Some new things will happen. There cannot be an entity in the financial industry without errors, without transaction errors, without even breaches. But how you prevent? For example, I'll tell you on an IT scenario. Suppose there was a system blackout for 2 days or a few hours on the internet, like you have seen in some of the banks and all that it happened. So what is the root cause? Did you arrest it? How many blackouts happened? How many system dropouts happened? That gives an indication whether the past time when it happened, what steps were taken, and whether those steps have resulted in efficacy of the systems. Next. So preventive risk management, friends, is about quality management. It's one of my very favorite topics. I did a lot of work on quality management, both in ICICI Bank and in the current company. And root cause analysis, ISO standards, preventive risk policy, identifying repetitive errors, and critical incident management. How do you report critical incidents? What is the freedom given to employees to report critical incidents, which actually help in remedial action? So fearlessness in reporting critical incidents is a very important part of HR culture. And I like this a lot because I did my MBA in NMIMS after many years at work, and that I did in HR. Wantonly because I wanted to understand how people's culture can make a positive impact on risk management and process management and customer service. And I found that if there is enough freedom without fear for people to report critical incidents and root causes are worked out, and the employee who reported the critical incident is rewarded, then a lot of risk management happens in the company proactively, where people participate in the roadmap towards a robust balance sheet. So these are the 4 pillars And the one other compass which I learned during my days in SBI Life was we did a very good work with Ramkrishna Bajaj National Quality Award. And it was a very good quality framework for me. I really liked it, and including the work I did with Quink Pro on quality management, it helped me understand that if our process management is based on organizational quality excellence programs, then many typical audit errors actually vanish, and we deal more with macro level, governance level audit issues, management audit, rather than repetitive audit. It is possible because you always look at processes to see how to mature the process to the next level. What kind of further programming you have to do in IT systems? How mature are our processes? How many processes can be automated? And this is an ongoing journey. It is a never-ending journey. There is no way that you will reach a total quality management of Six Sigma. Six Sigma is only in the fables. Otherwise, you will see most companies will be really at 3 Sigma, 2 Sigma, because it takes a lot of time, and the devil lies in the details. And you as auditors will know this very well, that most of the time the smallest mistake actually points to a very big breach. Next. So I'll come to the last slide, which is basically about what should you do as auditors when you go or when you start preparing for an audit of a bank or an insurance company. So let's try and figure out what the audit committee really wants to do. So it's a crystal ball gazing as to what exactly are the auditors coming for, and what do I have on my table. Things to do when you take up auditing. So next. So as I mentioned, this is a very good dipstick study, a very simple list for you. So previous audit reports, very, very important. Please read previous audit reports. Look at audit policy of the bank and the board policy. Read through them, try to get the essence, and try to link them to the previous audit reports. Whether the audit is happening on the areas which are critical as per the board risk policy. Sometimes you may be auditing areas which may be totally insignificant, whereas the risk policy has laid down the top 10 risks of the bank or the top 10 risks of the insurance company. Are we auditing the top 10 risks, or are we auditing things which are very, very minor? So you can take symptom from the risk policy of the bank. SOP and change management protocols. Who have the rights to change it? What are the delegation of powers? Financial powers, IT system powers. What are the change management protocols in the company? How often have they been revised? When was the last change affected? And how the change was affected? What was the process of affecting the change? Was it a committee decision? All these things help you to understand what is the entity to whom you are going to audit, what kind of an entity it is. Is it a Six Sigma company or is it a One Sigma company? What is it? So then it gives you an understanding how detailed you want to go into. Then root cause analysis of critical incidents and frauds. Legal suits. It gives you a lot of understanding what kind of legal suits have happened against a bank, or what kind of serious customer complaints have happened, which are open-ended, which kind of customers we said no to. Particularly, I'll tell you, there are two types of customer complaints. One customer complaint, I satisfy the complaint. The other one, I say no, I can't do it. So the one I say I can't do it are the ones which point to a deeper malice. The one I say I can do it, the only thing you have to see is that, okay, we rectified it. Was it a systemic issue? Did you only rectify the transaction, or did you rectify the whole thing? Suppose somebody complained that my vested bonus was not correct in the insurance statement. You went and corrected it, or did you go and do a root cause? That is simple. But suppose you said, no, you are only entitled to 2 rupees. Customer is saying my distributor told me something else. So there the malice is different. So the cases which you declined are the ones which are actually good material for us to understand what is going wrong in the industry, what kind of conflict of interest is happening. Suppose there's an allegation of a fraud in procurement of hardware. So you kind of try to see who are on the committee, what kind of conflict of interest can arise. So that gives you an understanding. So complaints, legal suits, anonymous complaints, critical incidents, whistleblowers, these things give you a very good handle on what exactly should be the sampling you should do. So ultimately, at the grassroots level, it is about the intelligence to take the right samples. Because ultimately, what you have for audit, you have samples. That's all. to get the right samples. What should you do? What kind of samples you should take is the very, very critical part. And in order to take the right samples, go through what went wrong in the company. And there is enough karma in the company. Every company, every bank, every insurance company has enough karma for you to know. And if you're going to a new company, you should read audit reports of other insurance companies or other banks, so that the same thing will repeat here also in 2 years, 3 years time. Observing key ratios at branch level, bank level, like I told you, NPA, gross NPA, net NPA, net interest income, monitoring shareholders pattern in case of private banks. And then finally, I said InfoSec policy. What is the InfoSec policy? What is the maturity model of the insurance InfoSec policy that they have put in place? It's a graded phase of automation in every bank or insurance company. It's not that everything is 100% automated. So what is the graded plan of automation? What is the future visioning? What is the business strategy of the company? What is the IT strategy of the company? I think when you go through them, you get a very good understanding of what exactly is the right way to sample transactions, because finally transaction output is what you audit, transaction input is what you audit. So to take intelligent sampling is the best course for any wise auditor. Next. So how can you add value as auditors in the BFSI sector? You see this cartoon, this says everything. Having audited your accounts, we can't find anything at all suspicious, which makes us very, very suspicious. So the shorter the summary of the audit report, it obviously gives signal that something else is missing. Next. So this is a very quick glance for you. How can you add value as auditors to the BFSI sector? Why you become the most demanded auditors? Point mistakes out early. Offer remedial solutions to SOPs, customer service. Suggest structures to better risk management and preventive root cause analysis. Many times auditors are asked informally outside the audit report to suggest many things. You can suggest better organizational structures. You can suggest suitable areas for management audit to devise structures for design thinking. If processes are designed at a macro level, it is design thinking for process efficiency, which makes a huge difference to the actual efficiency of the output level. Then offer quality management concepts. If you are well trained in Six Sigma, TQM, Ramkrishna Bajaj National Quality Award examiner processes, you will be able to offer collateral value to the organizations, because you will not only be doing auditing, but you will be able to offer other quality inputs to the organization. And then many. In fact, during my time, I remember I have asked the auditor, what are your discrete feedback about employees during the course of the audit? It gives very valuable inputs about how open is the audit and how open are employees to audit, and is the audit report really giving me the truth? So discrete information about what you felt about employees. Maybe auditors feel they're not well trained, they're not very knowledgeable, or somebody could say somebody doesn't give me, he plays the dodgeball. So discrete information helps you for training, for motivation, for building better people culture, because ultimately the best is HR culture. If you have the right HR culture, then I'm sure that audit will be a very, very exciting job for you, because in that company you will get what you want to see. Nobody will play dodgeball with you. At the same time, people will be very eager to understand what the auditor has to offer. And I'll give you a sample of how an audit report looks like. Next. So here are my recommendations. It's a short document, but we used a 2-point size font. So I could be very short, but I could put everything into that. Next. I'm running out of time here. So this is a typical audit reporting. You see key issues. So they are showing a risk rating, and last point you see, they are showing design versus operation issues. As I mentioned to you, what is the SOP? What is the operation issue? What is the process design? And what is the operation issue? And then residual risk. What is the risk left in the system? This is typically how good auditors report, so that they say that these risks are still to be addressed. These risks still remain to be addressed. So once you give a basic audit report and people reply, you say issue open, issue closed. Based on the issues open, you are able to arrive at whether this is a high risk entity or a medium risk entity or a low risk entity. A good auditor always manages to finally give the management what is the residual risk of this unit. And that gives the management a good way forward as to how to use it forward. So very nice way of reporting. I saw this format somewhere. It gives a very good idea about summary at a summary level. What should the management take as an input from the process shop that you audited, or from the branch that you audited, or from the bank that you audited? What is their take and what is their way forward? Next. So I have very little time left, but I just want to leave this cartoon with you. You know what this cartoon means and what is the indicator. We have too much goodwill on the balance sheet. I decided to sell it. Mysterious buyer offered $1 million. You know, we're talking about Kingfisher. Next. Next. This is a typical case of how sophisticated robbery happens in banks. And the dacoits came and looted cash, but somebody went with a suitcase of 11,400 crores. Just cyclical letters of credit. Next. Cyclical letters of credit are typically credits without underlying transactions. Next. This is a very interesting cartoon. 20 years as a cook will surely help us huge profits. 13,000 ghost employees. So salary is paid to employees who never existed on records. You kind of audit is the same whether it is manufacturing or BFSI, but the only difference is we deal everything in money. So what happened with the company that you are able to guess from this cartoon is much less than what it can happen in a bank or an insurance company, because we deal in money. Last. Yeah, I am through for the afternoon. And if there are any one or two questions, I'll just about have time before I rush out to the airport. And thank you all for this lovely audience. I was able to also, in the process of presenting, I was able to brush up my entire knowledge on banking, which I left in 2004. So last 15 years, I've been in insurance. So when Rukmini called me and asked me about insurance, I was very happy to do, but I had not prepared myself for banking. But then I had to brush up my topics over the last few days to brush up my entire corporate banking, entire retail banking, process banking. And I hope I have been of some use to you all. The subject is very vast. Time is limited. I've been forced to rush through topics. But I'm very happy to be with all of you. And it's been a real pleasure for me to interact with you all. If there are some quick questions I could answer, because at 12 I need to definitely leave. And I'll be more than welcome to answering questions separately if there are people who are interested to know more about banking and insurance. I'm lucky by God's grace to have got some of the best assignments in my life, some of the toughest assignments, and some of the most cherished award processes like the Ramkrishna Bajaj National Quality Award. So it's given me very good idea and input about how board governance happens. What are the things that at a board level, at a governance level, at a management level you can do to make healthy financial institutions happen in the country. Thank you so much.
Very much, Mr. Ravi. We have one question from Srinivas Raja Chandrasekharan. Can you suggest one good risk management tool for corporates, sir?
So the best risk management tool I will talk about is organizational structure review. Review this constantly, because most of risk issues in the companies happen out of conflict of interest. You'll be surprised. We think it happens out of IT programming, it happens, but who are the people who do this? People. It is ultimately people. So what is the kind, reviewing relationships between departments, reviewing reporting relationships, reviewing the relationship between vendors, suppliers, and organizations, and seeing whether there are any arbitrages that can happen and conflict of interest. You'll be surprised with this reply, because normally people give replies about system programming or NPA identification. I'm not getting into that, because all this happens because of either inadequate training, improper knowledge, or at a larger level breach due to conflict of interest.
Thank you, sir. I think someone, Mr. Karthik Narayanan, you have raised your hands. Would you like to put in your question in the Q&A box, sir? Rishi as well. There is a question from Uma Devi. She is thanked for the enriching session, and it has been helpful. So it is beneficial for auditors have product knowledge, but not all auditors, especially external, don't possess, making the audit confined to transactional issues than addressing systemic or structural issues. Could you share your insights, please?
So let me put it across very simply. Even if you don't have much of knowledge, maybe in the second or third attempt you will get to know. But as I mentioned to you, if you understand the business first, and then you go through previous reports, a good amount of understanding you will get before you go for an audit. You may not understand products completely, but then what you should do is, during the process of audit, converse a lot with the other side. You ask questions naively. They will give you so much knowledge, because their own bosses wouldn't have listened to them for ages. So they'll be most happy that somebody is at least listening to me, and they will vomit out every knowledge that they have, and you will get everything that you want. Just boost the massage the ego of the other guy, and you'll get everything. You don't have to worry. It takes time, definitely. Some of the sciences are difficult, but if you go through some overview of the industry or the banking and the insurance industry upfront, and you go and you start conversing with people and ask questions where you don't know, doesn't matter. An auditor doesn't need to feel ashamed that you don't know. It's perfectly normal to ask a ground employee, particularly because the ground employee will give you more knowledge than the guy who's prepared himself for the audit. Typically, the boss would be very prepared for the audit. He will give you exactly that much as you're supposed to know. But a ground employee will give you much more, because he is the guy who is thirsting to exhibit his knowledge. So there you get what you want. So I do understand that people who have been in the manufacturing sector will find some difficulties when you come to BFSI. But I can tell you, BFSI audit is very exciting. And you gain experience in 1 or 2 attempts, and you will really find that it is very exciting, and you come across things much more differently than manufacturing.
Will you have time for one more question, sir? There's one more question that we have, or should we take this offline?
Yeah, you can ask one more question.
Yeah. Okay. If an uniform approach has to be taken, then is there a platform where all such financial entities can assemble to discuss on regulatory guidelines and agree, so that all follow the same measures and means to ensure no parity, and regulators also not making subtle comment that while you are unable to interpret, the other bank or insurance entity has provided their deliverable with clarity of understanding. This puts the other entities on spot and subject to fines.
So I would say that this is one within your own forum itself. I don't know. This is the first time I'm getting to be with your forum. Your forum itself can help this in a big way. You can bring about common understanding. There is no actual common law or common rules for auditors so far shown, because one of the risks of giving common rules is that you get stereotyped, in which case you become very predictable. So it is better that an association of your kind brings auditors who specialize in BFSI audit together, so that you bring about common understanding. To my knowledge, I do not know whether regulatory bodies have come across with a common code of audit process or audit procedure. I am not aware of it. I may stand corrected. But a kind of a common training ground for auditors in the BFSI sector can well be created by such organizations like yours and many other organizations, you can come together. Another thing is you can have a lot of exchange forums that could help to some extent. Why we don't want a very common rule-based thing is that then it becomes very predictable. In which case, I can easily judge what you'll come for. If you have a common code of auditing, how long does it take for me in the organization to get hold of the code and decide, okay, this is what these guys will see? So to some extent, over a period of time, processes have evolved. If you talk to auditors who are doing BFSI, they will commonly tell you. And today, my attempt also has been to give you an understanding of the business and the context. I am very sure that people who are in this sector will give you something more evolved than this, but more or less on similar lines. So you'll get, I have given you a very good SOP of what kind of things to see. It should broadly help you to understand. See, the basic thing is what is the objective of an audit? An audit is supposed to test the accuracy of the profit and loss account at a macro level. Everything that you do is towards the testing the integrity, consistency, and integrity of the balance sheet of an organization. Towards that, you can adopt many routes, and that route depends on the maturity of the organization you're auditing. A bank which is a primary cooperative bank could be different. An evolved listed entity with subject to multiple audits is very different. I hope I have answered to some extent your question.
So we are getting more questions. So probably we'll circle back to you through over an email and get their responses. And
Grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, attendees. I will now hand over the session to Rukmini Kasi for delivering the vote of thanks.
Hello, everyone. We've had a great informative presentation. I'm sure all of us have become more knowledgeable with the session that we have attended. Mr. Ravi Krishnamurthy, with his varied, vast experience, has delivered his knowledge and his insight, along with so many snippets and lot of fun anecdotes to make the session so lively. So I'm grateful to Ravi sir. He's a top industry leader and a versatile expert in the BFS industry. It's very thoughtful of him to have accepted our invite, and we are very thankful for him to have taken this time out to share his knowledge with us. We are grateful to you, Ravi sir. No session can be successful without the audience. The audience has been very, proactive and has asked questions, which clearly, denotes, expresses the fact that they have all understood and they have got newer thoughts and they want to learn more. All in all, it was a wonderful session.
Thank you, madam. I need to rush now. Thank you so much for the lovely time with all of you.
Thanks
very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Ravi. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mani.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So we are closing the call, right?
Yes, sir. We are closing the call.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.